It is the early 16th century, in the heart of medieval England. King Henry VII rules with a firm hand, and the kingdom seems to be enjoying a period of relative peace after decades of civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses. But something else is in the air. Radical changes are about to happen that will alter the destiny of the country forever. Can you imagine the political tension and intrigue within the royal palaces? England was at a crossroads. On the one hand, the stability that came from the Tudor monarchy and the momentum of the restoration of order. But on the other, there were power struggles, relations with the rest of Europe, and religious conflicts that were beginning to gain momentum. Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty, had won this civil war, but he was not entirely secure on his throne, and he knew that his son, Henry VIII, would face many challenges as he took over. And before we take you deeper into the history of this fascinating dynasty, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like it and comment on what you already know about the context of England in the time of Henry VIII. This will help us a lot to continue bringing you incredible stories. Now, let's continue. Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, aged just 17, and England at the beginning of his reign was at a time of consolidation of monarchical power, but also full of challenges. The Kingdom of England was experiencing a period of relative peace after the Wars of the Roses, a long conflict between the rival families of Lancaster and York that had devastated the country. Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, finally put an end to this conflict, but the crown was still fragile. The power of the local nobility was growing, and the wealth of the merchants was beginning to alter social and economic dynamics. Furthermore, the Catholic Church still dominated the religious and political spheres of England. However, this was a time of great cultural and religious change in Europe, with the Renaissance flourishing and a new wave of thought and philosophy challenging the status quo. In many European countries, revolutionary ideas were emerging, and the Protestant Reformation was beginning to gain momentum, particularly in the minds of intellectuals such as Martin Luther, who questioned the authority of the Catholic Church. In this context, Henry VIII ascended the throne with a great challenge on his shoulders. Although England was relatively stable, it still had great challenges ahead. Relations with France and Spain, rival European powers, were volatile, and the English were still trying to establish themselves as a respected military power in Europe. Henry VIII, who was initially seen as a young and promising king, soon became embroiled in complex international political dynamics. But he also dealt with internal and personal issues that would later change the course of English history forever. His search for a male heir and his personal religious issues would be the catalyst for some of the most drastic and famous decisions of his reign. Henry VIII, though young, already knew the weight of his responsibility. The throne of England seemed secure, but one thing was certain: he needed a male heir to ensure the Tudor dynasty would remain strong. This desire was not just a personal whim, but a political matter of survival for the kingdom. The birth of a male child was seen as essential to maintaining the stability and continuity of the empire, and Henry VIII firmly believed that without a male heir, the kingdom would be in danger of division or falling into conflict. Early in his reign, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain, as part of a strategic alliance between the two countries. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother, Prince Arthur, who died shortly after the marriage, so she married Henry to preserve the political alliance. By marrying him, Henry hoped to secure a strong alliance with Spain and begin a strong lineage. But marriage to Catherine did not bring him what he most desired: a male heir. Although she gave birth to several children, the children often died in infancy, and his only surviving son, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died when he was only a few months old. Henry VIII's fears that his Tudor dynasty would not continue began to grow. The king knew that without a male heir, the throne could be challenged by other noble houses, especially the descendants of the York and Lancaster families, whose feuds were still fresh in his memory. Fear of dynastic instability began to consume Henry, and he began to consider a radical solution: to divorce Catherine and marry another woman who could give him the desired son. However, divorce was not a simple matter. Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I, was a woman respected by the Catholic Church, and Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage. England and the Catholic Church forever His frustration at the papal refusal led him to break with Rome and declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, creating a religious divide that would never be reconciled. This meant that, in addition to resolving his personal crisis, he was now creating a religious crisis for the whole of Europe. But in his quest for a male heir, Henry was also paving the way for one of the most controversial reigns in history. This personal struggle, initially focused solely on his desire to father a son, gradually became a power struggle, not just over the succession to his own throne, but over the authority of the Pope and his nation's relationship with the rest of Europe. The consequences of his decision to break with Rome would be immense, involving persecution, changes in religious beliefs, and deep divisions within the kingdom. Henry VIII, after years of unsuccessful attempts with Catherine of Aragon, fell in love with Anne Boleyn, a young, ambitious, and cunning woman who charmed the king in a way no other had done before. Anne was not only beautiful and charismatic, but also a woman who defied the rules and expectations of her time. She did not easily submit to the established power, and unlike other courtesans, refused to become Henry's mistress until he promised her marriage. This kind of attitude was radical for the time, and she became a figure of great interest to the king, who saw her as the key to his desire for a male heir. The relationship between the two was not only romantic but also politically charged. Anne was an intelligent, well-educated woman, and was well aware of how court and political alliances could benefit her. In falling in love with her, Henry was not only seeking a wife who could bear him a son, but also an ally who would help him challenge the Pope and the Catholic Church. Anne Boleyn was instrumental in his decision to break with Rome. By marrying Anne in 1533, Henry took a radical step by separating himself from the Catholic Church and declaring that he was now the supreme leader of the Church of England. The decision to marry Anne was therefore a political and religious maneuver that not only challenged papal authority, but also reconfigured the relationship between England and the rest of Europe. It not only isolated the country in terms of alliances, but also initiated a wave of religious persecution and internal divisions. Anne Boleyn, despite being Henry's great love and the woman for whom he broke ties with Rome, failed to live up to the king's expectations. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth I, who would later become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, but not the male heir that Henry so desired. Henry's frustration grew as time passed, and Anne, who had a strong personality and did not submit to the king's whims, came to be viewed with suspicion at court. The marriage, which began with promises of love and grandeur, quickly deteriorated, especially when Anne failed to produce the long-awaited son. She was the target of intrigue, slander, and accusations of adultery, incest, and even treason against the king, accusations that were later used as justification for her execution. Henry, already impatient and increasingly frustrated, saw his chance to maintain his dynasty as being in jeopardy. This led to a court case of trumped-up charges, which resulted in Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, just 3 years after her marriage to the king. Anne's death did not mean the end of Henry's desire for a male heir, but it was a turning point. Not only did she leave him with a daughter who would later become the powerful Elizabeth I, but she also caused Henry to turn to another woman, Jane Seymour, who would bear him his long-awaited son, Edward VI. Anne Boleyn's legacy did not die with her, however. Her daughter Elizabeth would go on to become one of the most important figures in English history, defying all expectations and cementing the Tudor dynasty in ways that Henry could never have foreseen. The birth of Elizabeth I in 1533 was a moment that promised to bring great hope and expectation to the reign of Henry VIII. But it also carried the weight of great challenges. Henry VIII finally had a daughter, but not yet the male heir he so desired. However, Elizabeth's birth was far from an ordinary event. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, a woman who defied the Catholic Church and was responsible for the break with Rome, creating the Church of England. Elizabeth carried in her blood, from birth, an enormous symbolic burden, that of being the heir to a divided kingdom and a reign marked by religious controversies. During her childhood, Elizabeth lived in an environment of great political and personal turmoil. After the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, in 1536, Elizabeth found herself removed from the center of power and was declared a bastard, with the title of daughter of a condemned woman. However, her intelligence and strong character did not go unnoticed. She began studying from an early age, learning Latin, French, Greek, and rhetoric, as well as being an excellent orator, which would later earn her a prominent position, despite being treated with contempt by many at her father's court, especially those who supported Queen Jane Seymour. Edward VI's mother, Elizabeth, grew up with a sharp mind and impressive diplomatic skills. Being the daughter of an executed queen, and being constantly reminded of her illegitimate status, gave her a strong sense of justice and self-sufficiency. The death of Edward VI in 1553, who died childless, left the throne of England vacant. This turbulent time in the history of the English monarchy saw a battle for succession. Mary VIII, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, assumed the throne, but her Catholic politics and marriage to Philip II of Spain made her unpopular with Protestants. Religious and political tensions were at their height, and Mary VII's accession to the throne had far-reaching consequences for the future of England. However, with the death of Mary I in 1558, Elizabeth I ascended the throne. She not only became Queen of England, but also a symbol of resilience and stability in times of great uncertainty. Her rise to power was England's opportunity to rebuild itself. She immediately established the Church of England firmly, reinforcing Protestantism as the religion of the realm, and challenging Catholic powers such as Spain and the papacy. Elizabeth I knew that her reign would need to be solid, with a distinct identity, to banish the ghosts of the past and ensure the legitimacy of her rule. She was one of the most astute political leaders of her time, skilled at manipulating alliances and enemies, both within and outside England. Under her leadership, England became a maritime power and began to challenge the dominant powers of the time, such as Spain, with great naval victories, such as the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. However, despite being one of the greatest icons of the English monarchy, Elizabeth's reign was also marked by a personal loneliness. She never married, despite pressure to do so, and became known as the Virgin Queen. Her personal life, or lack of a dynastic marriage, was constantly exploited as a symbol of sacrifice on behalf of the country, but it also raised many questions about her succession. Elizabeth I not only transformed England into a great power, but also made it a symbol of culture and innovation. Her reign was an era of great cultural flourishing, with the English Renaissance reaching its peak, especially in the arts. With figures such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, Elizabeth I's accession to the throne, her defense of the Anglican Church and her political skill shaped modern England, and at the same time, sealed her name as one of the greatest monarchs in history. Her ability to deal with internal and external challenges, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to build a legacy of greatness, cemented her as a fundamental figure for the future of the country. Elizabeth I, known for her political astuteness, faced internal and external challenges soon after assuming the throne. She knew that, in order to ensure the stability of her reign, she could not afford to make mistakes. Her rule was marked by a remarkable ability to manipulate alliances, negotiate with enemies, and above all maintain control over a country that was divided religiously and socially. Elizabeth's main battle was not only against foreign invaders, but also against those who wanted England to return to Catholicism. Her accession to the throne represented the continuation of the Anglican Reformation, begun by her father Henry VIII, and consolidated by her brother Edward VI. However, the country was divided. Many were still fervent Catholics loyal to the Pope, while others supported Protestantism. This religious schism generated tensions and could easily destabilize the kingdom. To deal with this, Elizabeth adopted a policy of limited religious toleration. She allowed Catholics to practice their faith in private, but required all to recognize her authority as supreme head of the Church of England. She avoided direct persecution of Catholics, but at the same time did not hesitate to act against those who challenged her rule or the new religious order. She still faced Catholic forces that wished to restore papal influence, especially with conspiratorial movements financed by Catholic powers in Europe, such as Spain and the papacy. Elizabeth also used her diplomatic skills to ensure the safety of her crown from foreign enemies. Spain, under the rule of Philip II, was one of the greatest challenges. Philip II, a fervent Catholic, saw Protestant England as a threat to his own authority and wanted to restore Catholicism to the country. The tension culminated in the Spanish Armada, which in 1588 attempted to invade England to depose Elizabeth and install the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, in her place. However, Elizabeth, with her strategic leadership and diplomatic skills, managed to defeat the Spanish Armada, cementing her image as a strong monarch capable of protecting the kingdom. But the threats did not come only from outside. Within England itself, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a constant source of conflict. Mary, who was a Catholic, was seen as the rightful heir to the English throne by many Catholics, who viewed Elizabeth as a bastard due to her excommunication by the Pope. For much of her reign, Elizabeth was pressured to take definitive action regarding Mary. Although initially hesitant, she eventually ordered Mary's execution in 1587, following a Catholic plot to assassinate her, known as the Babington Plot. Mary's execution was a drastic move, but it was also a fatal blow to any significant Catholic resistance. Internally, Elizabeth also had to deal with social and economic issues. Although she managed to maintain political stability, her reign was not without its difficulties. The nobility and the clergy were strong powers within the kingdom, and Elizabeth had to maintain a balance between the interests of the court and the common people. She used political alliances wisely, appointing loyal advisors and establishing relations with the nobility, while also seeking to limit the power of the great lords to prevent the rise of an oligarchy that could threaten her authority. His government was also marked by commercial expansion and the encouragement of maritime exploration, especially with Francis Drake, who challenged the Spanish Armada on voyages to the New World, plundering Spanish ships and establishing trade routes to England. But what most solidified Elizabeth's authority was her ability to maintain a strong and authoritative image, while also projecting an image of a virginal monarch, devoted to her people, something that made her a symbol of independence and feminine power. Her lack of marriage was seen as a personal sacrifice for the sake of England, and her ability to maintain the kingdom's self-sufficiency through strong diplomatic relations and a careful foreign policy ensured England's prosperity throughout her long reign. Elizabeth's legacy was one of stability, cultural prosperity, and a powerful England on the European stage. But as effective as her rule was, it was not without challenges. Her death in 1603, without direct heirs, led to the accession of James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England, unifying the crowns of England and Scotland. Elizabeth I's reign, lasting 45 years, was not only an era of political and religious stability, but also a golden age for the arts and culture. Elizabeth's England experienced an unprecedented cultural flowering with an explosion of literature, music, theatre, and the visual arts, which left an indelible mark on history. Elizabeth was a great patron of the arts. She knew that the prestige of her reign depended not only on her political skill, but also on a vibrant culture that demonstrated the strength and greatness of the nation. Her court was a center of intellectual and artistic innovation, attracting poets, artists, musicians, and playwrights from across the kingdom. Elizabeth, a woman of great intelligence and education, embraced culture as a tool to enhance her image as a wise and virtuous monarch. The Elizabethan period is best known for its literary impact, being one of the greatest eras of literary production in Western history. Theatre in particular played a central role during this period, with William Shakespeare emerging as the most prominent name. Shakespeare's plays, such as Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, and Othello, explored universal themes of love, betrayal, ambition, and human tragedy, and his works are considered some of the most influential in world literature. Theatre in London, especially at the famous Globe Theatre, theatre became the centre of English cultural life, with audiences flocking to see plays that reflected not only human drama, but also the political and social issues of the time. But Shakespeare was not the only name to emerge during Elizabeth's reign. Other important playwrights, such as Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and Edmund Spenser, also enriched English culture with their literary and theatrical works, many of which are still studied and appreciated today. Marlowe, for example, was one of the key figures in the creation of English Renaissance theatre, while Spenser is remembered for his great epic work, The Faerie Queene, which celebrates Elizabeth's monarchy in a symbolic and allegorical way. In addition to theatre, music flourished during Elizabeth's reign. Composers such as William Byrd and John Dowland helped establish English music as a respected and admired form of artistic expression in Europe. English Renaissance music was sophisticated, influential, and a reflection of the national unity that Elizabeth sought to cultivate. At court, Music and dance were popular forms of entertainment and cultural expression. Literature also expanded beyond the theatre. Poets and writers began to explore themes of love, identity, and social issues in innovative and creative ways. Sir Philip Sidney, with his work Astrophilosel and Stella, and Edmund Spenser with The Fairy Queen, not only contributed to the literature of their time, but established a lasting legacy for English poetry. The printing press also began to spread more widely, allowing the ideas and works of writers and poets to spread throughout England and beyond. Elizabeth's era was also marked by a significant growth in visual art. Artists of the time created formal portraits that went beyond simply depicting royal figures. These portraits helped to cement the public image of Elizabeth I as an eternal and almost divine queen. The most famous of these portraits is the Armada portrait, which depicts her as a strong monarch surrounded by symbolism of power and resistance, especially after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. But art was not limited to paintings. The architecture of the time also reflected the grandeur of Elizabeth's reign. Castles, palaces, and mansions were built or renovated, and Renaissance architectural forms began to dominate English architectural style. These buildings not only served as residences for the court, but were also symbols of power and wealth. This rich culture created a sense of national identity in England that was cemented throughout Elizabeth's reign. The culture of the time not only reflected English national pride, but also the religious and political unity under her leadership. In times of great religious and political turmoil, Elizabeth used culture as a tool of power, associating her image with that of an immortal monarch, capable of guiding the country through internal and external difficulties. The Elizabethan era, therefore, was not only a time of great military and political achievement, but also a period of great cultural innovation. It paved the way for modern England and helped establish the country as a cultural and intellectual powerhouse in Europe, with a legacy that endures to this day. The theatre, literature, and music of the Elizabethan era continue to inspire and influence the arts around the world. In 1588, Elizabeth I's England found itself facing one of the greatest challenges in its history, the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain, already one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, saw Elizabeth I not only as a threat to his authority, but also as an obstacle to his vision of a unified Catholic Europe under the Pope. Furthermore, attacks by English pirates, such as Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish ships in the New World, had infuriated the King of Spain, who now wished to destroy England and place his niece, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. The Spanish Armada, consisting of about 30 ships and over 30,000 men, was considered the most powerful naval force in the world at the time. Philip II's mission was clear: to invade England, depose Elizabeth I, and restore Catholicism to the country. Spain believed that its victory was virtually assured, and that Protestant England would easily fall before its might. However, Elizabeth I, with her political cunning and strategic vision, was not willing to succumb. She knew that her victory would depend not only on military strength, but also on clever planning. She had a smaller but well-trained and motivated navy, and she could count on the skill of experienced naval leaders such as Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Charles Howard, who were prepared to fight to the bitter end for the defense of the realm. The confrontation between the English and Spanish forces took place in the English Channel. When the Spanish Armada reached the English coast, the English fleet, more agile and able to maneuver quickly, attacked the Spanish ships. The English strategy was bold: ambushes, surprise attacks, and the use of ship's fire, where the English sent incendiary ships towards the Spanish ships, causing confusion and panic in the Spanish ranks. However, the greater part of the English victory came from an unbeatable combination of tactics and luck. Strong winds and unexpected storms were the deciding factors. The headwind forced the Spanish ships to scatter, and the English navy seized the opportunity to attack, wearing down the enemy. Furthermore, Elizabeth's rejection of the offer of surrender, which she held firm in her refusal to allow any possibility of submission to Spain, was crucial to the morale of her troops and the persistence of English resistance. In the end, the Spanish Armada was forced to retreat, having failed to complete its mission. Many Spanish ships were destroyed or damaged, and the Armada was forced to return to Spain, where the significant loss of life and resources weakened Philip II's position. The victory was a mortal blow to Spain's image of invincibility and secured England a prominent place on the European political and military scene. But most importantly, this victory cemented Elizabeth I's authority as a monarch. Not only had she defeated one of the most powerful military forces of the time, but she had also maintained her religious and political autonomy. Her leadership in the battle reinforced the idea that she was a strong leader capable of protecting the kingdom and the English people, reinforcing her image as a monarch chosen by God to guide the nation. The victory over the Spanish Armada was not just a military victory, it had a profound psychological impact. For the English, it was a symbol of resilience and the strength of Protestantism against the Catholic forces of Europe. Elizabeth was now not just a queen of a Protestant nation, she became the leader of an emerging power, with England finally establishing itself as a major maritime power and beginning to expand its colonial influences. This victory also had a lasting impact on international relations. Spain, already weakened by war with other European powers, was never able to regain the position of naval dominance it had previously enjoyed. England, on the other hand, continued to grow in strength and influence, ushering in an era of colonial expansion that would later result in the British Empire. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not just a temporary military victory, it had a profound and lasting impact on English history, transforming the country into a global power and establishing the reign of Elizabeth I as a landmark in European history. First, the victory guaranteed national security and ensured that England would remain Protestant-free from the threat of a return to Catholicism. Philip II of Spain represented not only a military threat, but also a powerful political and religious force, with the support of the Pope and several Catholic monarchs. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was therefore a clear sign that Protestant England could resist external pressure and maintain its religious and political autonomy. Furthermore, this victory had significant implications for the rise of the English Navy. England, previously seen as a minor power on the European stage, now emerged as one of the world's greatest naval powers. The defeat of the Armada not only boosted national morale, but also helped to cement the English Navy as a dominant force in the Atlantic and the seas around England. The success of Francis Drake, who played a crucial role in defeating the Armada, inspired the construction of a strong and well-equipped navy, which would later help England establish global trade routes and conquer colonies in the Americas and beyond. The growth of English naval power was vital to England's imperial expansion in the following centuries. During Elizabeth's reign, the country began to invest in maritime exploration, with explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake making voyages to the Americas and other territories, establishing trading posts and establishing colonies. This marked the beginning of a colonial empire that would expand in the following centuries, with England eventually controlling vast territories around the world. In addition to transforming England into a maritime power, the victory also cemented Elizabeth I's position as the absolute leader of the kingdom. Her image as a warrior queen, capable of facing the greatest powers in Europe, was reinforced. She was seen as a divine monarch, chosen to protect her nation and ensure the future of the Tudor dynasty. The victory of the Armada not only strengthened her domestic authority, but also cemented the loyalty of the English nobility and people, who saw Elizabeth as a monarch capable of leading the country to greatness. The impact of the victory over the Armada also had consequences for foreign policy. With the defeat of Spain, England became a respected power in Europe and began to assume a more aggressive stance in international relations. The weakening of Catholic Spain paved the way for the strengthening of Protestant alliances, especially with countries such as the Netherlands, which was at war with Spain, and France, where religious and political tensions with Spain were also high. With the economic prosperity that followed her victory and commercial expansion, Elizabeth's reign became an era of cultural innovation. Increased resources allowed for a flourishing of the arts, and as we have already discussed, the English Renaissance experienced its peak with great playwrights, poets and artists such as William Shakespeare, who enriched English culture and helped solidify England as a cultural centre. However, the victories did not come without challenges. The threat of the Catholic Counter-Reformation remained present, and relations with Spain remained strained throughout Elizabeth's reign, although she managed to maintain stability and power. Her death in 1603, without direct heirs, marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, with the accession of James I, King of Scots, who unified the crowns of England and Scotland, consolidating the Stuart dynasty. But the legacy of the victory over the Spanish Armada endured. Not only had England defeated one of the world's greatest military forces, it had also secured its position as a maritime and colonial power. The spirit of resilience, courage, and national unity became part of England's DNA, and the victory of 1588 would always be remembered as one of the greatest achievements of Elizabeth I's reign. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603, at the age of 69, ended the reign of one of the most iconic figures in English history. Her death, leaving no direct heirs, marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over 100 years. Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen, due to her decision never to marry and never to have children, left the question of succession hanging. The country needed a new monarch, and the big question that loomed was, who would take the throne? The transition to the Stuart dynasty was a significant event. The selection of James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a natural move, as he was Elizabeth's cousin and had been recognized as the legitimate heir. James was a direct descendant of Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty, and had a dynastic claim to the English throne. His accession to the English throne as James I was an attempt to unify the crowns of England and Scotland, creating a greater British monarchy. The reign of James I ushered in a new political era, but it also presented significant challenges for the country. The unification of the crowns of the two nations was not straightforward. Although James was well-intentioned, he found an England divided internally, with religious and political tensions still very much present, especially over Catherine of Aragon, Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Catholic and Protestant movements that had become more radical over time. For Elizabeth I, her reign had been marked by her ability to maintain religious and political peace, balancing internal tensions and ensuring the security of the kingdom. However, with the accession of James I, the issues that Elizabeth had skillfully avoided began to take shape. The new king struggled to maintain the religious balance between Catholics and Protestants. In addition, James I attempted to centralize more power in the crown, which created tensions with Parliament and with the growing class of burgesses and merchants who were more interested in representative government than in royal absolutism. The Stuart dynasty faced additional challenges, particularly from the Puritan movement, which sought more radical reforms of the Church of England, something that James, despite being a Protestant, was unwilling to support. Political tensions with Parliament led to a confrontation that culminated in the English Civil War in the 1640s, many years after Elizabeth's death. The lack of a clear succession, as Elizabeth had planned during her reign, led to a period of uncertainty. In terms of foreign policy, James I's reign also brought some difficulties. England's relationship with Spain, a Catholic power, continued to be a delicate issue, especially after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. James tried to maintain peace with Spain, but this policy of concord with the Catholic powers did not fully please the English Protestants, who still remembered the threat of the Spanish Armada. Despite the difficulties, the death of Elizabeth I and the accession of James I were a landmark in English history, not only because of the transition of power, but because it opened the way to new challenges and an uncertain future. England was now about to enter a new phase, in which the balance between absolute monarchy and parliamentary government would be tested in ways that Elizabeth had avoided. Furthermore, the reign of James I brought the unification of the two crowns, and ultimately, the creation of the United Kingdom. But Elizabeth I's lasting impact, her political skill, and her mastery in navigating the turbulent waters of politics and religion would still be remembered as a golden age of the English monarchy. Elizabeth, with her ability to confront international challenges, defend Protestantism, and consolidate national identity, left an unmistakable legacy that would continue to influence generations to come. Elizabeth I's reign not only defined England in its era, but also set the stage for the country's rise to become one of the world's greatest powers. Although Elizabeth left the throne in 1603 without direct heirs, her legacy was monumental. Under her leadership, England grew stronger politically, culturally, and militarily, laying the foundation for the future British Empire. Elizabeth's greatest achievements was the establishment of England as a naval power. She faced down the challenge of a powerful Catholic Spain, represented by Philip II, and managed to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588, ensuring not only the survival of the kingdom, but also creating a legacy of naval strength that would continue to thrive in the centuries to come. Victory in the Armada not only weakened Spain, but also inspired confidence that England could become a world power, dominating the seas and expanding its trade routes. Elizabeth also had a lasting impact on religious matters, with Protestantism becoming the dominant religion in England. The Anglican Church, which she had established, resisted both internal and external pressures, creating a unique religious identity for the country. This ensured internal stability and a sense of unity among the English, something that would be crucial to the future growth of the empire. Furthermore, the Elizabethan period was also an era of exploration and commercial expansion. During Elizabeth's reign, England began exploring new lands and engaging in transatlantic trade, especially with the Americas. Explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake made voyages to the New World, establishing trading posts and colonizing territories. Although these early colonies were small, they planted the seeds for what would later become the British Empire, a colonial empire that spanned entire continents, making England a global superpower. With the death of Elizabeth and the accession of James I, England entered a new phase, but Elizabeth's legacy continued to be visible. James I, who united the crowns of England and Scotland, attempted to establish a more centralized monarchy, but faced resistance from Parliament. However, the rise of the British Empire was not consolidated until the following centuries, when later kings and queens, such as Charles I, Charles II, and Victoria, expanded the boundaries of the empire and consolidated England's global greatness. In terms of culture, Elizabeth also left an immeasurable legacy. The English Renaissance, which flourished under her rule, produced some of the greatest names in literature, with William Shakespeare being the most famous among them. His works helped define the English language and are still studied and performed around the world. Theatre became a symbol of national identity, and music and poetry also flourished, with composers such as William Byrd helping to establish English music as an internationally respected form of expression. Despite the difficulties and challenges, Elizabeth I was instrumental in shaping a modern England, capable of competing with the great powers of the time, such as Spain and France. She not only stabilized domestic politics and ensured the success of religious reform, but she was also instrumental in the birth of an imperialist nation, laying the foundations for England's future imperial rise. Tudor dynasty came to an end with the death of Elizabeth, but the legacy of the British Empire, naval power, and flourishing English culture continued to expand in the following centuries, with the Industrial Revolution and the conquest of colonies throughout the world. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the Kingdom of England was left without direct heirs. Her decision never to marry and to name no successor left the throne without a clear line of succession. This meant that, upon her death, the throne would have to pass to a monarch from the next available royal family, with dynastic right. The choice fell on James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, unifying the crowns of England and Scotland and creating what became known as the United Kingdom. The transition from a Tudor dynasty to a Stuart dynasty was significant, as James I, although a Tudor descendant through the line of Henry VII, was not English by birth and had a Scottish upbringing. The rise of the Stuart dynasty to power was not straightforward. James I faced a number of challenges in consolidating his authority, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy. James I was immediately faced with a religious conflict that had not been fully resolved during Elizabeth's reign. The Protestant Reformation, which she had established, was still causing deep divisions in England. On the one hand, Anglican Protestants saw the English monarchy as the head of the church and a bulwark against Catholic influence, while many Catholics still hoped to see a return of Catholicism to England. James, as a Protestant, was unable to appease the two groups, and his policy of religious tolerance was not enough to prevent the sectarian conflicts that erupted during his reign. In addition, there was growing tension between the monarchy and Parliament. James I believed in an absolutist government based on the idea of the divine right of kings, meaning that he believed his power to rule was given directly by God, and that Parliament had no authority to question his leadership. This created friction with a Parliament that was beginning to demand greater political rights and control over taxation. This tension between the power of the crown and parliamentary power grew throughout the reign of James I and his sons, culminating in the English Revolution and the Civil War in the following years. James also faced a series of economic and political crises. The royal bankruptcy, caused by excessive spending and England's involvement in foreign wars, forced the monarch to seek new sources of revenue, which resulted in a deterioration in relations with Parliament. In addition, the question of succession remained a problem, as James I had no surviving sons with strong political support within the English court. The religious question, however, was one of the greatest challenges facing James I. In 1605, a group of Catholic conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, attempted to assassinate the king and destroy Parliament in an event that became known as the Gunpowder Plot. The failure of this plot further reinforced the distrust between Catholics and the Protestant government of James I. Religious tensions intensified throughout the reign of his son, Charles I, which would lead to catastrophic events in the 1640s. The transition to the Stuart dynasty also marked a change in the international landscape. England's relationship with Spain became more diplomatic after the victory against the Spanish Armada, but alliance with France, also a Catholic nation, began to be explored. The reign of James I was a period of diplomatic attempts to maintain peace with the European powers, but also a time of increasing internal tension due to religious and dynastic challenges. Despite the challenges, the transition to the Stuarts and the union of the crowns of England and Scotland had a lasting impact, setting the stage for the later reign of Charles I and eventually the English Revolution, which would profoundly change the system of government in the country. The reign of Charles I, James I's son, began with promises of stability, but quickly turned into one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Like his father, Charles was a firm believer in the divine right of kings, the idea that the king was appointed by God and therefore not subject to the control of Parliament. This belief in monarchical absolutism was a major factor in the English Revolution, a conflict that would divide the country and forever change the political structure of England. In the early years of his reign, Charles I had already begun to clash with Parliament. He demanded large sums of money to finance his wars and military expansion, but Parliament refused to grant him the necessary funds without guarantees that his rights would be respected. When Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled without it for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, tensions only increased. During this period, he adopted unpopular policies, such as imposing taxes without Parliament's approval and using arbitrary levies to raise funds. In 1640, with the kingdom in financial crisis and in need of more resources to deal with internal problems and the war with Scotland, Charles was forced to summon the Long Parliament, which quickly opposed his authority. Tensions between the monarch and Parliament exploded in 1642, when the English Revolution began, an armed conflict between royalist forces loyal to the king and parliamentary forces who sought to limit the monarch's power and establish a more representative system. The conflict quickly escalated into civil war. The parliamentarians, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell, formed the New Model Army, a highly disciplined force that opposed the more traditional and disorganized Royal Army. After several years of fighting and parliamentarian advances, Charles I was defeated. In 1646, he surrendered to the parliamentarian forces and was imprisoned. The parliamentary victory did not mean an immediate end to the struggle. There were negotiations and attempts to reach an agreement, but Charles, who never fully accepted giving up his power, was eventually branded a traitor by the House of Commons. In 1649, the royal court found him guilty of treason, and in a dramatic and historic act, Charles I was beheaded in Whitehall Square. His execution was a radical and unprecedented moment in the history of the English monarchy. It was the first time that a king had been executed by his own people. The death of Charles I did not lead to an immediate restoration of the monarchy. Instead, England entered a new phase with the founding of the Commonwealth. Under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, the country became a republic without a monarch, ruled by a protector. Cromwell proclaimed himself Lord Protector. Cromwell and his followers attempted to implement a new system of government where power was in the hands of Parliament and the civil government, rather than being centralized around a monarch. However, Cromwell's Commonwealth was marked by religious rigidity, with Puritanism being imposed as the official ideology. Cromwell sought to create a society based on Puritan principles, and this created tensions, especially among those who wanted more religious freedom and a less authoritarian system of government. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the Puritan Republic went into decline. The English people, tired of military dictatorship and lack of stability, began to call for the return of a monarch. In 1660, the Restoration took place, with the return to the throne of Charles I's son Charles II, and the Stuart dynasty was restored. However, the impact of Charles I's execution and the period of the Commonwealth have never been erased. The English Revolution left a lasting legacy, laying the foundations for a more limited and representative government, and laying the seeds for future changes in the relationship between the monarchy and Parliament. The beheading of Charles I marked the end of the idea of absolute monarchy in England, and the absolute glory of the king began to give way to the idea that the monarch should be limited by law and Parliament. The English system of government was transformed forever, with the power of the monarch being tempered by the growing strength of Parliament, a change that would culminate in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Bill of Rights of 1689, which would lay the foundations of British constitutional government. After the turbulent period of the Commonwealth, in which England was ruled by Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan dynasty, the monarchy was finally restored in 1660 with the accession of Charles II, son of Charles I. This event, known as the Restoration, marked the end of nearly 2 decades of Republican rule and the return to the monarchical system that had been interrupted by the execution of his father. Charles II was widely welcomed to the throne, especially after the rigidity of Cromwell's Puritan regime. England, tired of military dictatorship and the imposition of harsh religious rules, and eager to restore order and stability, received Charles II with great expectations. He became known as the Merry King because of his charismatic personality and his willingness to promote a more liberal and entertaining court after the austere Puritan regime of Cromwell. The Restoration was not only a restoration of the monarchy, but also of the Anglican Church. Cromwell's government had attempted to impose a puritanical system of strict religious practice, which had caused great dissatisfaction among both Catholics and Anglicans. With the return of Charles II, the Church of England was restored as the state religion, and religious freedom was granted to the Anglicans, although there were still tensions regarding other religious practices, such as Catholic and Puritan ones. During the reign of Charles II, England experienced a period of economic and cultural recovery. The restoration of the arts was one of the most notable features of his reign, with an explosion of artistic and literary creativity. English culture experienced a revival of the arts, literature, and drama, with playwrights such as John Dryden and theatres reopening in London after having been closed under Cromwell. Charles II's courts became centres of amusement and indulgence, reflecting the change from the rigid and austere behaviour of the Puritan era. However, the Restoration also brought political and social challenges. Charles II, although popular, did not enjoy a conflict-free government. Parliament, which had gained power during the Commonwealth, became more influential and resistant to the idea of an absolute monarch. Charles II, like his predecessors, still believed in the divine power of the monarchy, but the need to balance the monarchical and parliamentary forces was evident. Religious issues also remained a source of tension. Although the Church of England had been restored, persecution of Catholics and Puritans continued, and Charles II, who was sympathetic to Catholicism, was unable to completely alleviate religious divisions. His brother, James II, who was Catholic, would face serious religious problems during his reign, resulting in further divisions, and finally the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when he was deposed. Furthermore, the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London of 1666 caused great destruction and suffering, but also led to the renewal of the city. The fire was particularly important as it destroyed much of the medieval city of London and paved the way for urban modernization, with the rebuilding of the city in a more planned and structured way. In the international arena, the restoration of the monarchy brought a new dynamic to foreign relations. Charles II sought to establish diplomatic and commercial alliances, especially with European powers such as France and the Netherlands. England also began its first forays into colonial trade and imperial expansion, with the founding of colonies in the Americas and the increase in English influence in global trade. This began what would become the British Empire, although the consolidation of this empire would not occur until decades later. Despite the difficulties, Charles II's reign is often remembered as a period of recovery for England after the instability of the Commonwealth. He not only restored the monarchy and the Anglican Church, but also ushered in an era of cultural and social regeneration. However, the struggle for a balance between monarchy and parliament would continue to be a central theme in English politics, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which definitively established constitutional monarchy in England. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was one of the most decisive moments in English history. It not only transformed the English monarchy, but also forever changed the relationship between the king and parliament, establishing the principle that the monarchy should be limited by law and could not rule without the consent of parliament. This pivotal event was not only a political revolution, but also a fundamental change in the nature of government in England, marking the end of monarchical absolutism and the beginning of constitutional monarchy. King James II, son of Charles I and brother of Charles II, ascended the throne in 1685, with great hopes of restoring absolute monarchy. However, his reign was fraught with controversy, largely due to his Catholicism. James II was a devout Catholic, which generated great distrust among English Protestants. In the post-Reformation context, the accession of a Catholic monarch was seen as a threat to England's Protestant religious identity. Furthermore, James II sought to expand royal power, which created further tensions with Parliament and with the institutions that had been strengthened during the reign of Elizabeth I and her Tudor successors. One of the major issues that led to the Glorious Revolution was James's attempt to reverse the religious and civil laws that protected Protestants. He was accused of trying to restore Catholicism to the country, and his attempts to suspend parliamentary acts and appoint Catholics to high public office sparked a strong resistance movement. The fear that James II would attempt to establish an authoritarian, Catholic regime was a key factor in the opposition. The response to this threat came from the Protestant royal family, specifically from James II's son-in-law, Prince William of Orange, also known as William III of the Netherlands, who was married to James's daughter Mary II, a fervent Protestant. When English political and military leaders feared a Catholic restoration under James II, they invited William and Mary to invade England and seize the throne. The invasion took place without major confrontation, and James II was deposed. The monarchy passed to William and Mary, who accepted the crown, on the condition that they sign the Bill of Rights of 1689, a landmark document that would limit the monarch's powers and strengthen Parliament. The signing of this Bill of Rights was a landmark document that established that government in England should be based on the consent of Parliament, and that monarchs could not rule without the approval of a representative House of the people. The Glorious Revolution was not just a change of throne, but represented a fundamental change in the political structure of the country, laying the foundations for the constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government that would characterize England for centuries to come. Parliament's right to control the country's finances and limit royal powers became a central principle of British politics, preventing any attempts at monarchical absolutism in the future. Furthermore, the Glorious Revolution helped solidify the rise of Protestantism and the precariousness of Catholicism in England. By deposing a Catholic king and placing a Protestant monarch on the throne, the revolution cemented England as a bastion of Protestantism in Europe. This religious and political transformation also had lasting impacts on international relations, with England aligning itself more closely with other Protestant nations, such as the Netherlands and Sweden, in opposition to the Catholic powers of the time such as France and Spain. The Glorious Revolution also had lasting effects on the development of parliamentary democracy in England. After the revolution, Parliament became a more powerful institution, able to influence the country's domestic and foreign policy. Although the monarchy still existed, royal power was now severely limited by the democratic institutions that ensured the active participation of the people in politics. The foundations of English constitutionalism were now laid, and the Bill of Rights of 1689 would become a model for future constitutions and for the idea of representative government in other parts of the world. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was undoubtedly a crucial turning point in the political and social history of England. By establishing the foundations for a constitutional monarchy and giving Parliament a decisive role in the governance of the country, the revolution laid the foundations for a new system of government that would eventually make England one of the most influential powers in the world. Although the power of the monarchy was substantially limited by the Bill of Rights of 1689, the subsequent reigns of William III and Mary II, and later Anne I, still saw the monarchy as the central figure of the state. However, parliamentary institutions were strengthened significantly, with Parliament exercising increasing control over fiscal, political, and military matters. The right to consent to the imposition of taxes became crucial, and representative government began to take hold more clearly, with Parliament gradually acquiring more power and influence in the following decades. The political legacy of the Glorious Revolution was not limited to the government of England alone, but also had a lasting impact on the formation of democratic governments around the world. The limitation of royal power and the promotion of constitutional government served as a model for other nations seeking to free themselves from absolute monarchies, as was the case in the American Revolution in the 18th century. However, the most profound consequences of the Glorious Revolution began to unfold in the 18th century when England underwent a radical transformation of its economy and society, a process that would become known as the Industrial Revolution. Political stability and strong government institutions allowed England to invest in technological innovation and international trade, with Parliament controlling finances and encouraging expanded trade and investment in infrastructure. England began to industrialize. Laying the foundation for the Industrial Revolution, the country would become the global leader in the production of manufactured goods, largely thanks to the invention of new machines and production techniques, such as James Watt's steam engine and the power loom. The Industrial Revolution transformed England from an agricultural nation into one of the world's leading industrial powers. It created wealth and power for the merchant class and the nobility, but it also created deep social inequalities, with the exploitation of workers in factories and the expansion of poor living conditions in cities. The impact of the Valovis was not only economic, but also social and cultural, as urbanization and increased global trade forever changed the social dynamics of England and the world. With the success of the Industrial Revolution, England became a colonial superpower, with empires spread across every continent, most notably in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Throughout the 19th century, the British Empire expanded, and England assumed a position of world leadership, with unrivaled naval power and a capitalist economy that dominated global trade. Yours rise as a world power would not have been possible without the foundations laid by the Glorious Revolution, which allowed Parliament to rule alongside the monarchy and ensured the political stability necessary to drive economic expansion and technological innovation. The Industrial Revolution, along with England's growing naval and colonial power, was a direct result of the political changes initiated by the Glorious Revolution of 16. The impact of this historical moment not only shaped England in the 18th and 19th centuries, but also helped define the global order that would influence the 20th century, when England would continue to expand its empire, while facing new internal and external challenges, with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. If you liked this content and want to see more incredible stories about kings, queens, and moments that transformed the world, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your opinion or suggestions of other historical topics that you would like to see here. This helps us a lot to continue bringing more videos and quality content. Until next time, and thanks for joining us on this journey through history.